We will begin in 60 seconds.
Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa, haere, haere, haere mai. My name is Jonathan Godfrey. I'm the chair of the Independent Monitoring Mechanism for New Zealand. It's my very warm pleasure to have you join us today. The Independent Monitoring Mechanism is a partnership between the DPO, Disabled People's Organisations Coalition, the Human Rights Commission, and the Office of the Ombudsman. We are mandated under the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. But this is New Zealand, and there are things that New Zealand does differently to the rest of the world. And so it's my pleasure to invite Ike Rakena to offer karakia this morning.
Whakarongo. Ko wai te manu e tau nei, ko wai te kōrihi e tau nei. Ka rongo te pō, ka karanga te ao. Tarataki ne tai hau i te ā whio. Takahi ara kia hua ki ngā tatau ki te kura i monoa. He tauira no tua whakarere. He taria no tua whakaoati. E rauranga tira mā. Whakatau mai rā. Whakatika ki te ora. Whakatika ki te pai. He mana, he reo, kia tukua, kia puta, a tihei I mauri ora. Listen here too. Who is the bird that has arrived? Who is the songbird that has arrived? The night listens as the day calls aloud. Bring forth the turbulence of the winds, to trample the pathway and the open thresholds toward te kuri monoa. A student of ancient learning, a student of School of Academy. To our esteemed guests, welcome forth, to give goodness in life, to give kindness here too, and greatness in dialogue to let out into the world. Tihei mauri ora. Let us pray. He honore, he gloria, he maunga rongo ki te whenua he whakaaro pai ki ngā tangata katoa. Hanga e te atu he ngā kauhau ki roto ki tēnā ki tēnā o mātou. Whakatongia tō wairua tapu hei āwhina hei tohutui a mātou I roto I tēnei hui. Ko koe te kaha me te gloria, mo ake tonu atu. Āmine. Honour and glory in the highest, peace on earth, and goodwill to all of us. Dear Lord, give within us a compassionate heart. Be able to guide us through the meeting of today so that you are able to provoke and give us good thought and discussion to what we have to do during this gathering. We ask this in your name being the highest, from here until there. Amen.
He aroha, he whakapono, me te rangi mai e tātou te aroha. Te whakapono, Me
Eterum Marie, Tato Tato.
Thank you. This morning's session is an opening session for what is going to be 4 days of interaction between the independent monitoring mechanism and the New Zealand government. This morning's session has speeches from me, the Minister, Carmel Sepuloni, to follow, and then the Human Rights Commissioner, Disability Rights Commissioner, Paula Tesoriero, and Chief Ombudsman Peter Boshier, to fully describe how the National Forum is going to proceed over the next week and 1 day. I will allow time at the end of all the formal speeches to give you more details. But first, let's move into the opening addresses. The United Nations Committee gave New Zealand over 100 recommendations at the conclusion of our first examination back in 2014. They ranged from some very big issues affecting hundreds of thousands of disabled people, down to a few that had an impact on only relatively few disabled people. When New Zealand is examined again in August this year, we ought to expect the UN Committee to ask New Zealand which of those recommendations have been acted upon. For example, one of those recommendations was for New Zealand to cease sterilisation. It might only affect hundreds of disabled people, but the impact of sterilisation is lifelong, it's life-altering, and it's often done without the consent of the disabled person. I reject the notion that changing the sterilisation laws is too hard, but government funding to stop those operations could have been cut at the stroke of a ministerial pen years ago. In contrast, having data on the outcomes of all disabled people doesn't materially improve our lives until such time as someone uses that data to develop a new policy, make a new plan, or implement a work program. Data was one of the big issues raised by the UN Committee back in 2014, and New Zealand is definitely making progress in this area. More and more government agencies are collecting data and evidence to compare the outcomes for disabled versus non-disabled people. I'll refer to this difference as the disability equity gap. Disabled people know that these equity gaps exist today. But because the voice of disabled people has not been sufficient to produce change, we needed hard evidence. We've got a lot of hard evidence right now. Almost without exception, there is an equity gap being experienced by disabled people today. There is, unfortunately, very little evidence today on whether this equity gap is closing. We will know more as agencies collect their second and third snapshots of the equity gap. I want to note the successful prioritisation of disabled people in the vaccine rollout program during 2021. We know this was a success for disabled people because we have the data. The government made a decision about prioritising disabled people because many disabled people were more vulnerable. On the whole, it worked. This is a clear sign that thinking about equity of outcomes was deemed important in that context. We ought to expect that the bigger issues are the harder ones to tackle. But the UN Convention doesn't ask for countries to make change overnight. The ongoing impoverishment of disabled people has consequences on the educational and health outcomes for those disabled people. There is also increasing evidence that families supporting disabled children are noticeably impoverished too. That means that even non-disabled people are suffering low educational and health outcomes because their family is struggling with the effects of disability. Disabled people still struggle to find suitable housing, meaning that many disabled adults still live with their aging parents today. Assuming those disabled people won't all die before their parents, New Zealand will have a massive social problem when those parents have reduced ability to provide for their adult-aged disabled children. After all, there comes a time when we will all reach an age where we need support. This forum is a watershed point in our nation's response to the needs of disabled people, because we can see what our government has done or plans to do to progressively realise the UN Convention. The primary role of the independent monitoring mechanism is to monitor government actions towards the full realisation of the rights of disabled people. The Making Disability Rights Real reports presented numerous recommendations for government agencies to address. These reports were informed by engagement with disabled people across New Zealand. The Disabled People's Organisation Coalition works with the Donald Beasley Institute to undertake what we call disabled person-led monitoring. All voices of disabled people and their families can feed into this national forum. Our recommendations have merit because we talked with disabled people and because we listened to them. In general, the independent monitoring mechanism asks questions and addresses issues that have a long-term impact on the lives of disabled people. In the current pandemic, it might feel like we're responding to an urgent and hopefully short-lived situation. But the reality is that if disabled people do not get equal or better treatment from health, community, and support services, a disproportionate number of disabled people will die. They could die because more of them have health concerns that reduce the likelihood of survival. They could die because some of them will find it hard to communicate their needs in a timely manner. They could die because they didn't get the information they needed to take up the vaccine rollout. They could die because they've been deprived of essential services because their day-to-day support needs fail them while critical staff are unable to work due to sickness. These issues aren't new. The pandemic did not create comorbidities, and it did not create inadequate provision of information. The difference is, though, that comorbidities weren't created by humans. But providing information is definitely the responsibility of humans. I'm going to ask you to paraphrase a Chinese proverb that I really like for yourselves. The best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago. The second best time is now. And I now ask you, when should we have solved the problems faced by disabled people? New Zealand did not solve all the problems faced by disabled people 20 years ago. And some people have just had to wait too long for government agencies to decide that they need to do some research, run a pilot, evaluate the pilot, and so on. Some disabled people are just fed up, while others are conditioned to endure a substandard existence. I believe, though, that it is unfair to say that nothing is being done. There are numerous aspects of disabled people's lives that have improved over the last 20 years. The last 14 years since we ratified the UN Convention, or even the 8 years since New Zealand was examined by the UN Committee. There are, though, too many instances where government agencies do not put the needs of disabled people at the forefront of their thinking when decisions are made. Serving the interests of disabled people is inconsistent at best. I believe that this national forum will show us that meeting the needs of disabled people is generally done by running special projects. And there is a place for special projects. We do need them. Disabled people do need specifically targeted services, and special projects can reduce the disability equity gap. At some point in our future, we must get to the point where meeting the needs of disabled people is business as usual. I ask you to listen to the answers provided by government and see how many of them point to a culture that recognises the rightful place of disabled Kiwis to participate as full citizens in our country. How often will we hear that a chief executive has a performance indicator to ensure that their agency provides the same services to disabled people as it does to anyone else? You might be wondering, what's the point of this forum? And I have to share with you that I'm an optimist. I wouldn't be here today if I wasn't an optimist. I believe that we can choose to have a discussion that acknowledges the wrongs against disabled people and moves on to recognising the rights of disabled people. New Zealand needs more discussions about how best to create change that will materially benefit disabled people. Government needs to remember that anyone who doesn't learn from the mistakes of the past is destined to repeat them. Government also needs to know that acting boldly is what disabled people need. Sometimes we will make mistakes when we take chances. But I ask you, are we a nation that wants to see the All Blacks play as a team and run the ball, or are we happy to support a game plan that kicks for touch most of the time? Sir Edmund Hillary wouldn't have climbed Everest if he'd sat down and looked at the hills from a distance. He wouldn't have climbed Everest if he'd thought it was too hard. But he did look at Everest and admit that it was quite a big hill. He made a plan, though, to conquer Everest. The key is that he did make a plan and he conquered Everest. But most importantly, he did not make that plan and he did not conquer that mountain on his own. Many disabled people and their families are living their own personal Everests today. Surely those Kiwis deserve to see that their government has a plan to conquer our collective Everest. That is what this National Forum is for. Thank you. It's now my pleasure to pass to Minister for Disability Issues, Carmel Sepuloni.
Morena, Jonathan, and tēnā koutou katoa. A very hard act to follow, Jonathan. That was a wonderful speech and well put, and you traversed, I think, every possible area that needed to be covered in this forum. So thank you for opening us up so incredibly well. Before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge and thank our IMM partners, the Human Rights Commission, the Office of the Ombudsman, and Disabled People's Organisations Coalition for the considerable work they have put into this forum. Government officials who have worked hard to prepare their responses while working on other high priority projects in the Disability Action Plan, including managing the COVID-19 response, establishing the new Ministry for Disabled People, transforming the disability support system by rolling out Enabling Good Lives, developing accessibility legislation, transforming oranga tamariki, increasing accessible housing, making our transport system better, making the justice system fairer, making the education system more inclusive, and the list could go on. There is a lot happening. All of you who are watching and listening online, I know the impact of all the opportunities I have just mentioned will hopefully make your lives and the lives of your whānau fairer and more equitable. This forum is a great opportunity for further dialogue on the progress we are making to implement the UN Convention and will help inform deliberations with the UN Committee later this year. This forum also sits alongside comprehensive written responses agencies have made to the recommendations contained in the IMM's two recent Making Disability Rights Real in Aotearoa reports. This is a significant occasion. It is the first time that we've held a forum for the IMM, government agencies on behalf of the New Zealand government and disabled and non-disabled people to talk directly with each other about the progress that has been made to advance the rights of disabled people in Aotearoa New Zealand. I'm really glad that we are getting this opportunity before the government and the IMM will report in September to the United Nations Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. You may know this forum was originally planned to be held at Parliament. Due to COVID restrictions, we are doing it online. Although I would have loved for this forum to be held at Parliament, this is not a bad thing. Holding the forum online will enable a lot more people to hear each other and share in the dialogue. I'm proud of the progress we have made together. I know you'll be thinking how long this journey is taking. Many of you have been part of this journey for many years, and I acknowledge that. I acknowledge Jonathan's words previously or earlier when he said the best time to start something is 20 years ago, the second best time is now. Many things were started 20 years ago, and some are just being started now. But this is progress and the journey of progress. It's about continuing to take action to implement changes so that we can achieve the progress that we're all seeking. Working in partnership, of course, does take time, but the outcome is so much better than if any of us tried to make progress without the others. The new Ministry for Disabled People is something I'm sure that you'll be interested in hearing me speak a little bit about. You will all know that we are establishing the new ministry. We are still working on a final name, but at this moment we are still referring to it as the Ministry for Disabled People. The new ministry will be responsible for driving better outcomes for disabled people, leading cross-government strategic disability policy, delivering and transforming disability support services, and progressing the disability system transformation. But as you will hear at this forum, as this forum progresses, the new ministry will not be doing all the work to make better lives for disabled people by themselves. All government agencies have a responsibility for all citizens of Aotearoa New Zealand. This means that other government agencies will continue to be responsible for including disabled people in their work. Housing, transport, education, health, and most other agencies continue to include disabled children, young people, and adults in their work. The new ministry, in partnership with disabled people in whānau, will be able to assist, to monitor and report to ensure progress is being made in the right direction, in the right way, for the right outcomes, and with the consistency of effort that Jonathan referred to as being necessary. There is strong support for the new ministry. It is a response to the many disabled people who have called for a ministry that represents their interests and aspirations. The new ministry will provide a new home within government for continuing to progress the approaches, principles, and aspirations of enabling good lives and systems transformation. Disabled people have told us for many years that the disabled person, their family and whānau, need to be at the centre of the system, and that choice and control is their choice and control, not the choice and control of others. I'm aware that the disability phase of the Y2575 Health Services and Outcomes Inquiry has commenced along with the first claimant hearings and will continue over the next 12 months. We need to listen carefully to the submissions and honour tangata whaikaha Māori and their family whānau who are bringing issues to the tribunal. We need to be ready to learn from the submissions and the tribunal deliberations. We need to honour our te tiriti obligations and our disability convention obligations. Our disability support system, disability policy, and all policy makers across government must honour the diversity of the disability community. Giving effect to te tiriti has been essential to the voice mechanisms being developed within the new ministry and the accessibility legislation. The call for the Crown to be part of a tripartite relationship that is both te tiriti and UN convention based is work to be accomplished. The Crown alone cannot define how that will be. Although the new ministry will begin from 1 July, it will take time to build. The foundations of partnership will be laid, but it needs to be robust and sustainable, and so we all need to work together to build it carefully. It will take some patience and it will take some time. Together, we will also continue to drive ongoing transformation of the disability system in line with the Enabling Good Lives approach. Although this has been a long time coming, we have learned lots along the way, which means we can truly be transformational and change the system. I know many of you continue to experience the barriers of inaccessibility each day. I'm sure also that, like me, you continue to read and hear stories on a daily basis, reminding us about inaccessible houses, recreation facilities, public buildings. However, hopefully you will have heard about our new approach to accessibility through standalone legislation and establishing an accessibility governance board. The examples that I referred to previously or just now have all been physical access related issues or areas, but we mustn't forget that access to information and data continue to be barriers as well. The legislation will set out a framework for a progressive approach to identifying, preventing and removing barriers to participation. This is not merely a try and fix it for now solution. This will commit the current and future governments to ongoing promotion and improvement to accessibility in New Zealand. The Accelerating Accessibility Work Programme is a practical way in which we can honour one of the key principles in the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. It is a story we can be proud to tell the UN Committee. I'm really excited to see this forum happen for the first time. It makes so much sense for government agencies to share progress with disabled people, whānau and allies, and to hear what is important to disabled people. It is equally important that disabled people hear what agencies are doing and keep them accountable and on the right track. I look forward to reading what comes out of the forum and to be part of the planning for Geneva. We do have good stories to tell. Progress may not seem fast enough, but everyone here will be doing their best to ensure the rights of disabled people are known, heard and included in all work involving citizens of Aotearoa New Zealand. We are only at the beginning of a new chapter in our journey, and we all need to keep partnering together to make this the best that it can be. My best wishes for this forum, and again, thank you all for the work you are doing to transform our country into a non-disabling society where all can participate in an inclusive and accessible way, listening and sharing with each other as you are doing over the next 2 weeks. I'm confident that we have good news to share. The last 2 years have not been easy. It has reminded us that real commitment to the Convention and the New Zealand Disability Strategy is yet to be fully embedded across government and in our communities. We do need to be honest in calling out where and when we can do better, and equally, we must learn and build on what is good. This forum, as we participate in the UN process in Geneva in September, and the Y2575 hearings are an opportunity to learn, reflect and commit. The aspirations of the Convention, Tercero, the New Zealand Disability Strategy must all become realities. We have a lot to tell the UN Committee when we meet them in Geneva in September. We have much more to progress the rights and aspirations of disabled people, their whānau and family, and we should not and will not forget that. But I think it's also important that we acknowledge the progress that has been made. And we're all hopeful that not only are we able to achieve more progress, but hopefully at a greater speed. So can I say to everyone on this Zoom call, whaftai lava, thank you so much for everything that you have contributed and for listening to me. If you see me slip away, that's only because I've got my caucus meeting and I do need to be there at some point in time. But I do and will have officials that are making sure that they keep in the loop about what is being discussed. Whaftai lava, everyone.
Thank you, Minister. It's my pleasure now to introduce Disability Rights Commissioner Paula Tesoriero.
Thank you, Jonathan. I ngā mana i ngā reo raurangatirama tēnā koutou katoa. Ko Paula Tercero tōku ingoa, ko o te kaihutu, tika hauatanga, mō te kāhui, tika tangata ki Aotearoa. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Nā mihi ki a koe mātua Ike. Thank you for setting our pathway for today and for a rich and productive forum. I add my greetings to Minister Sepuloni and thank her for her words. I also want to welcome everyone watching. I want to acknowledge and welcome government officials and acknowledge Brian Coffey for his leadership at the Office of Disability Issues in assisting in making this forum happen. And I acknowledge my IMM partners, the Disabled People's Organisation Coalition, and the Office of the Ombudsman, and all of the staff and leaders in our respective organisations who have made this forum happen. I also want to acknowledge the advocacy for rights of all disabled people, past and present, and their families and whānau, many of whom are watching in Aotearoa. Thank you for being here. When the IMM launched its monitoring report, Making Disability Rights Real in 2020, we urged government to work with disabled people to implement the recommendations and to take a holistic approach to doing so, because our rights are so interconnected. This forum, 2 years later, is a formal response to those recommendations ahead of the examination in Geneva later this year. COVID-19 has understandably taken priority and attention from all of the parties here today. Tangata whenua, government, communities, tangata whaikaha Māori and disabled people, families, and also the IMM members. But COVID has also highlighted how critical it is to implement these recommendations without delay. The pandemic further exposed and worsened the inequalities experienced by disabled people and compound further the intersecting inequalities arising from colonisation, racism and ableism experienced by tangata whaikaha Māori. Overall, New Zealand's response to COVID has undoubtedly saved lives. But it also needs to be recognised that there have been insufficient safeguards and supports for disabled people and their families during the pandemic, and this needs strengthening. Many in our community have been providing advice for the past 2 years to strengthen those safeguards and supports. Participation and partnership are only meaningful if recommendations are acted on and there is genuine change. The recommendations in our report touch on every aspect of life, and we will explore the response to several of these recommendations over the next few days. I want to highlight some recommendations that really underpin all of the recommendations and are fundamental to their successful implementation. The IMM recommended establishing sustainable mechanisms between government and tangata whaikaha Māori to ensure the voices of tangata whaikaha Māori are formally included in all disability-related policy and legislative development and any Crown Māori partnership initiatives. Secondly, we recommended enacting genuine and properly resourced partnership with disabled people. This extends to establishing mechanisms to suit the diversity of disabled people and includes specific experiences such as those of disabled children, disabled women, disabled people of diverse ethnicities. And we recommended embedding the Disability Convention in legislation and ensuring the public service accessed education about the convention led by disabled people. Implementing these recommendations would support the fundamental shift in understanding what the convention intends. This shift to a human rights model of disability, recognising disabled people as full rights holders. I want to talk a little bit about this human rights model, which affirms that disabled people cannot be treated differently or excluded from society for any reason. Yet, we are excluded in our education system, our health system, our labour market, public spaces and places. We are excluded from accessing a decent home. And I could go on. What any government cannot do is argue that the kind or amount of funding required to facilitate inclusion is an acceptable reason to exclude or limit disabled people and their whānau's participation in society. You might hear the term progressive realisation during this forum. It means, as Jonathan nicely put, that the government does not have to do everything at once. And this applies to the convention as a whole. But some rights, such as non-discrimination, equality before the law, and duties of reasonable accommodation, do require immediate realisation. Another important international human rights law that the government has a duty to demonstrate, and you'll hear about, is using maximum available resources to progressively realise the convention. And that is something the IMM will continue to monitor. We must acknowledge where there has been progress and where New Zealand has met some of the general obligations of the convention well. We have an active focal point in the Office for Disability Issues, whose role it is to coordinate government action. Other nations look to Aotearoa's IMM partnership model that mandates the inclusion of disabled people through the coalition as an inspiration and a way in which things could happen. There have been significant improvements in the collection of data, which is essential, as Jonathan has already outlined, for understanding the barriers disabled people and their families face, and for monitoring equity of outcomes. And we know there are still significant data gaps. While the potential of the new Ministry for Disabled People is yet to be realised, its establishment demonstrates the government have listened to disabled people's calls for the need to move disability support out of a health setting and to institute a social model and human rights approach to ensuring disabled people are able to participate in all elements of life on an equal basis with others. We must work together with the new ministry as we all reimagine a nation that willingly embraces full equality and acts to ensure accessibility, flexible supports, and rights-based policies to underpin them. And we must talk about ableism loudly. Policy and service delivery will only ever change in Aotearoa when we confront the harm that ableism causes. This thinking must change. For those who say good things take time, tangata whaikaha Māori have been waiting more than 150 years for the rights of rangatiratanga and equity guaranteed by Te Tiriti to be upheld. I want to take us back to another of the world's most important documents, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, where more than 70 years ago it was recognised that all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. For this to be true in Aotearoa, we must base our action on Te Tiriti and reshape our approach for disabled people and tangata whaikaha Māori across every policy domain, because every policy is a disability policy. International conventions are not lofty goals that we sign up to when we're across the other side of the world and then merely glance at them, take them out of the top drawer from time to time, or tell the world how great we are going. The people who know whether we are true to those goals are disabled people, tangata whaikaha Māori, and our families and our whānau. This is the opportunity to tell the world how it's going. So I end where I began. thanking you for dedicating your time to this forum. Rapid action is required to address the very real daily limits on the freedoms, the rights and participation of disabled people and tangata whaikaha Māori. I look forward to a forum where we acknowledge progress made, but also the considerable work yet to do to advance the convention. In my role, I often hear many agencies and organisations tell me, Paula, we'll get to disability. The time to get to disability is now. Ngā mihi nui kia koutou katoa.
Thanks, Paula. Wonderful stuff. I now call on the Chief Ombudsman, Peter Boshier, for your opening remarks, please.
Kia ora mai tātou katoa. Me pēnei he kōrero timatanga māku. I'm going to start this really important forum with a karakia, and I'm going to translate it for you afterwards so that it can be given to everyone. Ku nanga ki te whito, o rangi e tūnei. He nana riri, he nana taua. Ui nuku, ui rangi. Te tongia te kawaru rā, ko te hautonga ka maringa mai rā. Kia mau rā. Toki nui te toki, toki rō te toki, toki tā wahie, ka whanatu au, ka hāhau i te takapu o rangi e tūnei. Ka hinga, ka mati, kia papa tuanuku e takoto nei. Whakatakata hau ki te uru, whakatakata hau ki te tonga, kia mā kina ki uta, kia mā taratara ki tai. E he ake ana te atāku rā, he tiau he huka, he hau hu tihei Mauriora. And it's very much about solving disputes. And it translates, forbidding the sky above full of dread, angrily raging, striving. The earth quakes, the heavens quiver. Naught stands before the shattering gale of the piercing winds blowing forth. Hold fast to the renowned adze, the famed long-handled adze, the adze rendering asunder the great trees. I stride forth boldly, striking the base of the tree. Though sky-piercing it falls, it expires to the earth below. Cease now, O wind from the west. Cease now, O wind from the south. I want to start by thanking the Minister for her comments and acknowledge the mahi of all of those who have worked to support this national forum. I recognise the importance of disabled people leading the national forum and engaging directly with central government and other agencies. I look forward to constructive dialogue over the course of the national forum. Working collaboratively is extremely important to ensure disabled people can live a good life here in Aotearoa. Well, let's start with COVID-19. COVID-19 has cast its shadow as it has elsewhere over this forum. It's forced us online. It would have been wonderful to have actually held this in person, but health and well-being of all of us must be considered first and foremost, and it has enabled wide reach. I note that there is a session tomorrow exploring the experiences of disabled people during the pandemic. What I would like to say, though, is that the pandemic has exposed many inequities for disabled people. These existed before the pandemic, but many stories have emerged showing inequalities have been exacerbated and made more visible during the response. I'm pleased that you, Paula, the Disability Rights Commissioner, has launched an urgent inquiry into the current experiences of tangata whaikaha Māori, disabled people and their families during the Omicron outbreak. The inspections which I do in my OPCAT role show that disabled people who live in group homes, prisons or residential care facilities have a heightened risk of getting COVID-19 due to the number of people in close proximity. It is for this reason that my staff have continued to inspect places of detention during the pandemic. Lessons must be learnt from the pandemic in order to better prepare for other possible emergencies. Learning from these will help to future-proof equity for disabled people in the next health crisis to affect Aotearoa. I wish to commend the many disabled people's organisations and other advocates who took measures to ensure disabled people's needs have been and continue to be considered during the pandemic. Now, a word or two about the IMM, the Independent Monitoring Mechanism. Some of its key functions are these, and there are three formal partners, which has been mentioned, but let's repeat. First of all, the Disabled People's Organisations Coalition. Secondly, the Human Rights Commission. And thirdly, the Office of the Ombudsman. The purpose of the IMM is to promote, protect and monitor implementation of the Disability Convention in New Zealand in order to help make disability rights real. The IMM holds these roles pursuant to Article 33(2) of the Convention. The purpose of the Disability Convention itself is to make sure disabled people are treated with dignity and respect and have the same rights as everybody else. New Zealand signed the Disability Convention in March 2007, ratifying it in September 2008. Under the Disability Convention, governments have a duty to work towards a more inclusive society by aligning policies and laws with the Disability Convention. To give effect to the Disability Convention and the "nothing about us without us" mantra of the disability community, the government must ensure disabled people are actively involved in all matters affecting them. Now, the key objectives of the IMM include holding the government to account on disability rights, and that is at the very heart of this national forum. Secondly, ensuring the government responds to and implements our recommendations. Thirdly, informing government decision-making and policy development. Our IMM reports show monitoring has made a difference to disabled people's lives. Next, raising awareness and recognition in policy development that around a quarter of New Zealanders are disabled. Next, ensuring effective consultation processes with disabled people in place. And finally, improving outcomes for disabled people in all areas of life. So the IMM will continue to report on disability rights in Aotearoa. Over the course of the past 2 years, the IMM has published a Making Disability Rights Real report, focusing on New Zealand's adherence to the rights enshrined in the Disability Convention, as well as a specific report focusing on disability rights in New Zealand during the initial stages of the COVID-19 pandemic. It's pleasing to note that the IMM was commended by the United Nations Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities in 2014 for setting up a mechanism to fulfil the requirements of Article 33 of the Disability Convention. So it's time for me to draw to a close and to conclude with some remarks. I agree with others. There's still a quantum leap required to remove disparities for disabled people in New Zealand. We must take all steps to ensure barriers are removed and disabled people can succeed. I'd like to take this opportunity to wish all parties a constructive and productive national forum. I hope that you're all looking forward to being a part of this very important occasion. Finally, it's significant to note that outcomes of the National Forum will be covered in a report that the IMM puts together for the United Nations Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities to inform our country's examination later this year. So my colleagues of the IMM, Dr. Jonathan as the chair, kia ora anō, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou huri noa, tēnā tātou katoa.
Thank you, Peter. We're in a bit of an online environment, and I guess things have to be done a little bit differently, and we don't get to pass notes across the table to one another to remind each other of things. And it's a bit of a time in New Zealand where everyone has to be flexible. So some things for this event have a plan, and everything has got a plan B, because we don't know how anyone will be on the day. The IMM is a partnership. You've been reminded several times that it's the Disabled People's Organisation Coalition, the Human Rights Commission, and the Office of the Ombudsman. But not only is the IMM a partnership, but the IMM process of monitoring is a partnership. This forum ought to be seen as a partnership. It's not just the IMM. It's not just ODI, the Office for Disability Issues. There are a host of other government officials who have been called upon to contribute to this forum. Partnership doesn't always mean we agree with each other. But having a partnership means we can have a discussion or a dialogue to understand any disagreements. There's never going to be enough time to thank everyone who has made a commitment for the success in the planning or the implementation of this forum. For every person you see speak on camera, there's at least 2 others in the background who won't get named. This is a massive undertaking by people who are actively involved, but also one of the most important people we need to acknowledge and say thank you to is you, the audience. This event is for New Zealand's disabled people. Yes, this event helps the IMM do its job. Yes, this event helps government officials prepare for the UN Committee's examination of New Zealand later in the year. But primarily, this event is for disabled people and their families. We are living in what some people are finding quite trying circumstances. I'm sure something will go wrong at some point during this event. The phone will ring when I'm not muted because someone's got to pass a note to me in a hurry. We're going to be told that someone can't turn up because they're not well enough. We're going to have to discuss Plan B. But that's New Zealand at the moment. and we can do it. The information that describes how the forum will unfold between now and the 6th of April is available on the specific webpage for the event hosted by the Human Rights Commission. I'm going to repeat some of the information now to give you a good heads up about what is going to happen between now and the 6th of April, and a little bit more about what's going to happen after that as well. On each of the 4 days, today, tomorrow, and the 5th and 6th of April, next week, there are 2 sessions. The morning sessions will start at 9 AM. The afternoon sessions will start at 1 PM. The next 6 sessions will all have quite a degree of similarity. That's because we've got to plan an event and make it work for dozens of people contributing. Each session is broken into 3 parts. Part 1 is very scripted. Part 1 consists of an opening statement and some questions, some primary or principal questions that were circulated to government officials 3 weeks ago. Government has had time to prepare its answers to those principal questions. While you are listening to the first part, while you are listening to those questions, while you are listening to the answers that we receive, you should find a way to record your personal response and the way you are thinking and feeling. If you can contribute using Slido, look for the link in the information you received that gave you the link that you are using right now. One link for Zoom, one link for Slido. Our audience cannot participate in the Zoom part, but you can make comments in the Slido environment. I strongly suggest to you that you don't try and write essays in Slido. And the reason why I'm going to suggest that is going to be made obvious fairly soon. Don't write essays. We really want you to save those for later on, when we will give them the attention that your views deserve. Part 2 is being done offline. Well, it's being done offline with respect to our audience, but it's not offline for the IMM and perhaps not for government officials either. We will be using the break in the broadcast proceedings to formulate supplementary questions to put to government. Those supplementary questions will be developed based on the live answers that we hear during the session. We have not been provided the answers to any of our principal questions yet. If you can contribute your comments, there is a chance that through the fast work behind the scenes, that your comments as a member of the public could find their way into those supplementary questions. We have people monitoring the Slido. Those contributions will be brought to the discussion that is held in part 2 while the audience is off having morning or afternoon tea, the work for the IMM continues. Those supplementary questions will be developed in the break, which might be only 40 minutes long. Part 3 is when we come back to the open broadcast and those supplementary questions are put to government. Part 3 is extremely unscripted. We have a plan, we don't have the words yet. It is almost certain that not all of the answers that we would like to our supplementary questions will be available to the officials who are with us at the time. But we do have a commitment from government to provide answers as fully as possible during part 3, and a commitment to follow up when they cannot provide the information requested. The IMM will get a response in the end from government. The findings from this forum will end up featuring in the report that the IMM has to then develop to send to the UN committee who will examine New Zealand in August this year. The Making Disability Rights Real reports were supposed to provide all the information that the UN committee needed. The world has done a few funny things in the last few years, and the UN is running later on its timeframes for when it planned to have invited New Zealand back to the table. And so instead of being there in 2020, New Zealand will be in Geneva in 2022. Given the way the world's been in the last few years, some of us were a little surprised that August 2022 is in fact when New Zealand will be there. I say be there. We don't yet even know if New Zealand will be represented in Geneva in person or whether we'll be doing it through a digital medium. But New Zealand will be there. Not just the New Zealand government, but the IMM will be there too. That means that disabled people and their families can be there too, because you are able to contribute to the work of the IMM. Your views are important. You can be part of the ongoing debate beyond this national forum. So, your small reminders, session 2 will start at 1 p.m. this afternoon. Session 3, 9 a.m. tomorrow morning. While we are in our breaks, if you return to the live broadcast, you should see and hear an indication that says you are in the right place, but that we are not back live at that time. I hope you do all enjoy listening. I hope many of you take up the chance to contribute as well. Just before I close the session, I'm going to return to Ike Rakena.
Ka huri no tēnā rā tātou katoa. Tēnā rā koe e tika e hautu e Jonathan. Mō tō mahi papai e aratake i nei kōrero. Tēnei huki te mihi ki a koe rā e te mineta o ngā take haua a Minister Sepuloni. Kia koe rā huki e Paula tō tātene hinei raikura, tō tātene mā raikura, tēnei te mihi. Uri noa kia koe rā e te rangatira, e tāpira, tēnei rā te mihi atu kia koe. Therefore, before we close this session, I just want to acknowledge our moderator and the steerer of our ship, Jonathan Godfrey. To Minister Sepuloni, who joined us earlier, we acknowledge. To our Human Rights Commissioner for Disability Rights, Paula tēnā koe te māreikura, nei kamihi atu ki atu. And also to our Ombudsman, Mr. Peter Boshier, tēnei kamihi atu. Mō reire, I roto I tēnā, ko tēnei te mihi atu ki a koutou rā, e rau rangatirama. Tēnei te mihi maioha, tēnei te mihi nui, ngā manaakitanga o te runga rawa ki runga I a koutou katoa. Therefore, to all of our esteemed guests who have joined us today within this session here, may the Lord bless you and keep you well until the time we come back again for further sessions. Therefore, ngā mihi, ngā mihi, ngā mihi. Tēnā koe, Jonathan.
Thank you, Ike. People, we are adjourned until 1 p.m. Your session chair at 1 p.m. will be Paula Tercero. Thank you for joining us. Mā te wā.